So the basics of Gong Fu is that you're steeping a tea multiple times. And what I've come to think of it as is you're having a conversation. You're getting to know the tea through this period of time where you're pouring water on it, letting it sit, and then drinking it. As opposed to if you just steep it for 5 minutes in hot water, the conversation happens, but it happens without your knowledge because everything is all mixed together all at once. When you drink the tea in multiple steeping, each tea has an arc where it will open up. It'll be pretty light in the beginning and then it'll come to a peak and then it'll come back down. And so it's a really fun process to go through. And every tea likes a certain temperature water. Every tea has good length of brew time that's going to give it its a certain type of flavor. I'm not going to say the best flavor because, you know, adjusting the brew time of each steeping can give you different aspects of the tea, and some are not necessarily better than others, but with certain tea, if you do steep them for a certain period of time too long, it won't be good. If you use too hot water on certain leaf, it won't be good. So the tea that I'm drinking right now is a 2005 Liu Bao. It's an aged tea, very similar to pu'er tea. And if you're just starting doing Gong Fu, these types of teas are good teas to start with because they like boiling water, right? So you get the water to a boiling point and you immediately turn it off. You don't have it be at a rolling boil for a long period of time. You don't want to do that. But just get the water to a boiling point, turn it off, put it in some sort of container that's going to maintain the temperature of the water so that it stays hot. So the nice thing about the pu'ers and the Liu Baos is they like hot water. Certain teas like oolongs, green teas, white teas, these teas you will want to start with a lower temperature water, and because if you put boiling water on them, the leaf is too sensitive for that and it will end up shocking the leaf and it'll start introducing certain flavors into the brew that really aren't the best for the best you could get out of that tea. So I think it's pretty good practice to start with a pu'er or a Liu Bao because it's very forgiving in terms of temperature water, and it's also very forgiving in terms of brew times. If you brew it too long, it's not going to be an issue. You're just going to get, you're just not going to get as fine of shades of the unfolding of the tea if you brew it for longer because parts of the unfolding are contained in that single brew, right? So, you know, it's something to learn. It's about your taste, you know, what you like in terms of the brew time. So you just getting starting to drink, and then you'll learn over time what you like and what's good for you. All right, water's done. Get this out of the way. All right, so now that we have our water boiled, we pour water on the leaf. Now, some people will do a rinse on the first steeping, which means that you just, you know, you're rinsing the leaf with this first steeping and then you dump it out. I think this is probably a good thing to do if you don't know where your tea was stored or you've never had it before, because what you'll get on the first steeping is a combination of the tea and then kind of some flavors associated with where the tea was stored, and also maybe any unwanted things that happen to the tea while in storage. So, you know, if you're not familiar with the tea, it's probably a good idea to do a rinse and just dump it out. However, I'm familiar with this tea, so I'm not going to dump out my first steeping. Now you'll notice when I brewed this, I was using this glass pot to pour the tea into. So in traditional Gong Fu, what you would do is you would pour your pot across the cups like this. And the reason you do that, so you don't want to like pour one cup full and then the next cup full. The reason you go across is because as the tea steeps, the bottom of the pot, the water at the bottom is going to have a more intense brew than what's at the top. So by going across, you make sure that each cup has a balanced amount of the lighter steeping at the top and the darker steeping at the bottom. So by pouring into a secondary vessel like this, that problem goes away because everything is going to become mixed uniformly within this pot right here. There are downsides to doing it this way, but to me, I find it's fine, and so I don't mind doing it. So now we'll do our second steeping here. And again, the timing of the brew comes to basically your conversation with the tea. You need to drink it a bunch to know, and it doesn't need to take a long time, but you'll know, like, okay, when I pour it, you look at the color. The color tells you a lot about how you did with the steeping. With each tea, you get to know, like I was talking about earlier, there's an arc that happens with the brew, and the color is a good indicator of where you are with that arc for each tea. So for certain teas, this might be the darkest it will get, but I know for this Liu Bao that this is not the darkest it will get, so I know that we're somewhere on the leading edge of the arc in terms of where we are with the journey of this tea. And in terms of tasting it, again, it all depends on your familiarity with a particular tea. But as you get used to drinking tea, you'll know if you underbrewed it or if the temperature of the water wasn't good enough. Like I said, the Liu Bao's in the pu'er is like really hot water. So if you put water that's too cool, like 180 degrees, 190 degrees, on a pu'er or a Liu Bao, you're going to get a very watered down version of what that tea could actually give you, because the temperature of the water isn't intense enough to actually break open that leaf and release the oils. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you have the right temperature water. And again, like I mentioned, you for certain leaf, you want to make sure it's not hot, too hot, because then it'll be too intense for that tea and it'll stretch it too far, and then you'll start getting unpleasant qualities of that tea coming out, like a really intense bitterness, or it'll just get the energy of it will just get really frazzled, and it'll have this intense caffeinated aspect to it, which you don't want. So when I first started drinking tea, I actually used a scale to measure out the leaf. I used a laser thermometer to measure the temperature of the water, so I was being very precise about it. That was my way, I think whatever things that you feel like you need to get started, go with that, because the point is, the only true learning happens when you start drinking tea, and this is the same for anything. So whatever you need to do to get started, also don't get into analysis paralysis mode thinking you need a certain pot, or like when I started, I didn't have all this stuff, Probably the way that I started was I had like a little glass pot, and glass is actually nice because it allows you, glass is energetically neutral. It's not going to add anything or take away anything from the tea. Whereas, different material pots like clay and metal, silver, etc., they're going to energetically influence the tea. So that's another level of the whole tea experience that you get into over time. Is different tea will do different things with different material. But in the beginning, a glass pot, a glass Gong Fu pot, which you can get for like 15 bucks, is really nice. I'll put a link below to a pot that you could get. Very basic. But the nice thing about it is, you're getting into the learning of the measuring of the leaf for the pot. Like a pot like this, a teaspoon in general, covering up the base of the pot is a good rule of thumb. You definitely don't want too much leaf because the leaf expands as you add water to it. So you don't want it to fill up the pot because then there won't be any room for the water to actually breathe and have the water release the oils from the tea. The more surface area the leaf is exposed to the water, the more of a good brew you'll get out of it. So, leaf amount depends on the size of the pot. But, this pot, I think, I'm not sure exactly the size of it. Maybe it's between 150 and 200 milliliters. But the glass pot I'll probably share is about that size. So if you put a teaspoon of tea in, that should work. But again, the other thing that's nice about the glass pot is you can see the color in real time as it's brewing within the pot. So and again, the color gives you a good indicator of where the tea's at and where the brew's at. So all of the senses are involved in a sense in brewing tea. You're seeing the color, you smell the leaf, and you're tasting the brew. You can feel the warmth of the water. And so it's one of the really interesting aspects as you kind of get deeper into tea. You're paying attention to all these things, and it becomes more of a feeling than a thinking process. In the beginning, you're just learning techniques, so it becomes a little bit clunky. But again, you don't have to think about all these things in the beginning. Just start drinking tea, and everything will kind of reveal itself to you in the right time. But this is one of the reasons why I'm really into tea, is because there's definitely the surface level aspects to it that are really nice. It's a nice ceremony. It's a good way to bring people together. It's a nice flavor. The energy of tea can be used to influence a situation. Like if I need to bring my energy down and I want to be more contemplative, I can drink a certain tea for that. If I want to energize myself and be creative, I can drink a certain tea for that. So it's a very dynamic plant, that can be used for many different things. But also, from a cultivation perspective, you learn sensitivity. And this is one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from tea and continue to learn, is the ability to listen, be aware at more subtle levels. And this naturally happens. It's not something that needs to be focused on or forced. It's just as you're drinking tea, over time, you will tune into more subtle levels of the experience. And in so doing, through this, you'll notice that will start flowing into other areas of your life. And that's when things become really interesting. So we can see now, we're at a darker level of a brew here than when we first started. So I would say the basics of getting started, if you want to start drinking tea, would be a glass pot. You don't necessarily need a cup like this in the beginning. In fact, you could just have a larger cup if you're just going to be drinking with yourself. you could just have a larger cup and pour the entire contents of this cup of this pot into the cup, and then just drink it that way. And that also would mean you wouldn't need a secondary vessel like this. So that would be the easiest way to get started. Just get a pot, some sort of kettle to brew, like a glass kettle probably is the best. Again, energetically, it's neutral, so it's not gonna add or take away anything. You definitely don't want to get like one of those fancy things at Teavana. I don't even know if Teavana's around, but like in tea shops, they'll sell cast iron pots, but on the inside they'll have enamel. It'll have a polished look to it on the inside. You don't want to do that. You don't want to use that. It's gonna, I don't know all the reasons, but just don't use those for this particular purpose. If you're just gonna be brewing water in the pot, get a glass pot. Secondarily, you could get a stainless steel pot that you put on the stove, something like that. Again, I'll put a link below to the to a glass kettle that's affordable and nice to use. But yeah, you start with a little glass pot, a little glass kettle, a cup, and you're good to go. And then, of course, it's the tea that you need to get. And this is, again, a whole area of learning. I mean, I drank tea for 5 years before I even got into sourcing my own tea. I would just buy it from my teacher, because he had connections, he had cultivated a sensitivity to buying good tea. Because the thing is, when choosing tea, most importantly, you want to make sure it has good energy, good chi in it. And, this has a lot to do with where the tea's grown, what practices were used in farming, are there any pesticides in it, how it was processed, how it was stored. It's just like, it's a whole nother world. And so having a good source is key. I'll put some links below to some basic sites that have good tea. But again, each site is going to be good at different types of tea. So livingtea.net, I believe it is. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it in the links below. But it has a good selection of tea, generally speaking. I know a lot of people who buy from them and enjoy their tea. Personally, I like essenceoftea.com. It's a little pricier, so it may not be the place to start buying tea, but I've gotten a lot of good teas from essenceoftea.com. In fact, this Liu Bao is from essenceoftea.com. And yeah, but again, I would say start with a pu'er or a Liu Bao. From a brewing perspective, it's going to be the most forgiving. Now, here's the thing. Another amazing thing about tea is energetically, it's so vast in terms of what it can offer us as an individual. And so while I like Liu Bao and pu'ers, your energetic constitution may just completely hate pu'er, which is totally fine, because when I first started drinking tea, I wasn't into pu'er. And also seasonally, I change naturally, without thinking, the type of tea that I like to drink changes, because there are different teas that are medicinally and energetically appropriate for a particular season. And this isn't something that needs to be thought of. It's just that when you drink it, it feels nourishing in that moment. And that's the thing about tea, is drink what you like to drink. There's no right or wrong tea except for what's right for you. And so that's what you have to play with. So if pu'er, if pu'er feels like something, because it's pu'er, generally speaking, energetically, you can go in two directions. There's more nuance to it, but the broad brushstrokes are you can go in two directions energetically with tea. You can go up and you can go down. when you smell a tea, this gives you an indication of where the tea is going to be taking you energetically. If you smell the tea, like for example a red tea or an aged white tea, when you smell these teas, they have a floral aspect to them, and it's light. There's a lightness to the scent. It's like smelling a flower. So when you think of a flower, you don't think of heavy things. So it becomes pretty intuitive to understand energetically where something's going to go based on smelling it. Light, floral, fruity, these types of profiles will generally, at least part of it will have an energy that's going up in this direction, right? Color can also tell you a lot. The lighter the color, the more likely the energy is going to be up in this register. The darker the color, the more it's going to be down and grounding, right? Now, Pu'er and Liu Bao, their smell is more earthy, dark, heavy, wet leaves, wet dirt, wet rock. So these are like kind of the profiles of Pu'er, generally speaking. And so when you think of those things, they naturally, you feel a bringing down an earth, down to the earth and the ground and grounding. And so this is what these teas will do. So if you're someone who could use more grounding, then go for a Pu'er. If you're someone who could use more uplifting, and this isn't to say that Pu'er can't be uplifting. Again, like teas are very complex and energetically they go in both directions, especially if they're good tea. But I'm, just starting basic. If you feel like you could use some energization and some creative energy, maybe you'd like to try a red tea or an aged white tea. Maybe even some oolongs. But the thing about oolong is a tea that has the most processing that goes into it. It's also the most challenging tea to brew. From getting the water temperature right, to getting the brewing temperature right, to getting it in the correct pot that's going to serve it the best. And again, this goes back to why I say Liu Bao and Pu'ers are a good place to start, because they are going to be sensitive to those things, but they're also going to give you a pretty good brew, even if you're not, it's kind of like sitting down at the piano. Anybody can sit down at the piano and like press some keys and make a sound out of it. But of course, there's a lifetime of learning you can still get from playing the piano. Whereas, say, like something like a flute, not everybody can just pick up a flute and start playing a flute, right? So the accessibility of Pu'er and Liu Bao, in terms of actually getting a good brew out of it, is lower. Accessibility is lower, is that right? Anyway, it's more accessible. So that's why I think it's a good starting point tea. And of course, I just love it. I think I do a lot of meditation in my life, whether officially on my asana sitting or unofficially just moment to moment having an internal awareness. So I really appreciate the supportive aspects of a Pu'er and a Liu Bao. Aged, again, younger Pu'ers are going to act very differently than older Pu'ers in terms of their energy. There's so much depth to tea. So there's a lot to cover. So I realize that in this video, I've covered a lot of ground. I've pretty much been flying over the vast lake of tea and kind of dipped in here and there to kind of expose different aspects of the experience. So, there may be a lot to take in. I don't know how this is going to land with people, but if you have questions, if there's something, particular thing that sparked an interest that you'd like to hear more depth on, let me know in the comments, because any one of these things could be its own video, its own series of video, its own course. And that, again, that's the amazing thing about tea as a teacher, because we learn the most from going into something deeply. Because in going into one thing deeply in a consistent way, it starts to reflect things about us more clearly. So in a way, when I drink tea, I'm learning about myself. And really anything can do that. If you're a painter, if you're a potter, if you're a musician, if you're an athlete, anything that you've done consistently and have a proficiency in can ultimately be a spiritual teacher for you. And so that's one of the amazing things, one of the things I appreciate about tea. And the thing I like about it as a method of being the teacher is that I can do it for personal cultivation practice, but then it's a whole different thing that opens up when I start serving tea to people. And again, this is another whole rabbit hole of that lake of the experience of tea that I was talking about. When you start serving tea to people, now you start noticing how things change within you in the presence of other people. What's the energy of the people at the table? How do I serve the tea in such a way to influence the energy? If I want to raise the energy up, if I want to bring the energy down, there are methods to do that in serving tea. And there are sensitivities and techniques that become apparent where you can move things in such a way to encourage being of service to people, giving them an environment, a space where things that may have been stagnant within their being come to the surface and are released. You know, you never know what conversation is going to happen around a tea ceremony, but one thing's for sure is that whatever conversation does happen, it's not going to be superficial. It's not going to be small talk. It's going to be something profound for everybody, where, because silence and stillness is the true healer. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of maybe you live in the city and then you go on a vacation to somewhere remote and peaceful. When you give yourself an opportunity to become still and relax, things come to the surface that had always been there but didn't have the opportunity to be expressed because everything was so active. You know, it's kind of like how the stars are not seen until the sun goes down. So tea ceremony is kind of like a portable it's a portable environment where you can create this atmosphere of stillness even if you're in a city. So that whole aspect of it is another beautiful medicine of tea. And it doesn't, and you don't have to wait to get that experience until you are an expert. You know, you could, the first time you brew tea, you can have this experience if you're serving somebody, even if you don't know what you're doing. Don't worry about it. You know, the most growth happens when we put ourselves in a situation where we feel resistance. Something, because resistance in itself means there's somewhere to go. There's something to get beyond. If we're completely comfortable, and then there's no potential energy to carry something forward. So anyway, I'm going to end it now, because of course I could continue to talk about this forever. Yeah, I hope this is something that resonates with people, because I love doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity to share in this way about these things. And so please, if something sparked an interest in you that can continue this conversation, let me know in the comments, because that'll be the next thing that I can talk about.